Welcome back, everyone, and welcome to our final talk. Would you believe the day's absolutely flown by, I think. But welcome to our final talk, and I wanted to welcome Abby Covert joining us all the way from sunny Florida, I believe. Would you believe it? Isn't it incredible? So thanks, Abby. Thanks so much for joining us. For those of you who don't know, Abby's an information architect, writer, and community organizer. Abby served as president of the AI Institute. She was co-chair of the AI Summit, the executive producer of IDEA, and also invented World IA Day. So we're absolutely, it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you here. And thanks so much, Abby, for joining us. You'll probably know Abby from actually the book that Dave waved around earlier during the day, How to Make Sense of Any Mess. And I've noticed that your room, Abby, is very, very tidy. So it all makes perfect sense. I was kind of hoping it was going to be just as messy as mine behind this glorious green screen I have behind me. So, Abby's currently working on a new book about diagramming, which I'm sure we're going to learn more about shortly. Abby's talk is called How to Diagram. And Abby, it sounds, is on a bit of a mission to rid the world of bad diagrams. So we're going to join her in her quest. And she's going to teach us more about the kind of purpose, the process, and the craft of diagramming. Because our diagrams probably suck, but they really don't have to. So let's watch Abby's talk, and we'll come back for some questions shortly.
I want to put all of my cards onto the table right up front. I am here to convince you that you don't know enough about diagramming yet. Now, maybe you're new to diagramming, in which case my job will be pretty easy. But more than likely, a few of you have been diagramming for a good long time, and yet you might leave this talk thinking you've been doing this whole time without really giving it much thought at all. Simply put, I'm here to teach you about diagramming because too many diagrams suck, and I want to change that. So like a Johnny Appleseed of diagrammatic technique, I am on the journey to rid the world of bad diagrams, one maker at a time, because diagrams are all around us if we're paying attention. The map that you use at that local hiking trail, diagram. The visual that you drew to make a point on the whiteboard, diagram. The directions that you followed to put together the last thing you got from IKEA, diagram. Diagrams, diagrams, diagrams. So as we get into the subject of diagrams, specifically as I lay out everyday examples of them, one of the first likely questions that we have to cover is, what is a diagram? But I have found that when this question arises, what we're actually almost always talking about is, what is not a diagram? After giving it some thought and a good lexicographical look-see, I have landed on a definition of diagram that places them quite high on an everydayness scale. Diagrams are found at the intersection of two criteria. One, to be a diagram, you must be both visually depicted, and two, helpful to someone in understanding something. So then you might wonder, well, what about bad diagrams? What if the maker intends the diagram to help someone to understand something, but then it falls short? Is that still a diagram? This question sent me down a path as a writer and a thinker that I am now the most thankful for. And I found my answer to this question in a duality of ways that one can look at the word diagram. Diagram as a noun feels best defined and ontologically bounded by the framing that a diagram must help someone to understand something in order to qualify as anything more than any other visual depiction. I like this as a teacher because it reminds us of our ever-present user-centered goal when diagramming. But also, as a practitioner, this definition keeps me from seeking perfection because it tells me when I am diagrammatically done. But what if the word diagram as a verb? What about the diagramming of it all? Here is where I think things get really interesting. As we're making these visual depictions that we hope we can coax into diagrams, we are diagramming that whole time. We're making diagrammatic decisions. We're using diagrammatic approaches. We might not have a diagram yet, but at a certain point, we know we're walking that way. Next stop, Diagram Town. And the walk that we do towards a diagram differs for each of us, each time. Our skill sets, experiences, and exposure to different patterns in diagramming, mixed with our context and the nature of the current challenge, impact the way that we get the diagrammatic work done. But in my work looking deeply at diagrams for the purpose of teaching others to get better at it, there are some common things about diagramming that I believe we can all learn from, regardless of our context or the current diagrammatic challenge. I want to show you how the diagrammatic decisions that we make over time tip a visual depiction over into being a diagram. We're going to spend some time dissecting the elements of diagrams, and then we're going to extrude a common diagrammatic journey to look at how much goes into a diagram becoming a diagram. My hope is that with this journey in the rear view, you will be better able to reach your full diagrammatic potential. Let's start by breaking down the 5 elements that make up every diagram. Whether it's a map, a chart, a flow, or any number of words used to describe types of diagrams, all have the following 5 elements in common: scale, shapes, lines, labels, and a key. Now, this list of 5 elements are what I'm calling the visual elements of the diagram because they are what the user actually sees. But I assure you that there is much more to diagramming than what meets the eye, literally in this case. I identified 3 additional elements to all diagrams that I believe are equally important to understand and account for in our diagrammatic process. I'm calling these the invisual elements because they are not shown to the user as visual elements themselves. They are instead projected in the visuals that are depicted. These are what the makers decide about the scope that the diagram takes on and maybe what it ignores, the intention that's behind the diagram, and of course, the audience that it seeks to serve. When it comes down to it, diagramming is about making a series of decisions about how to visualize something. But it's actually the combination of both the visual and these 3 critical invisual elements that determine the ultimate success or failure of a diagram. Next, we're going to walk through a flow diagram about diagramming. Nerdy, I know. So this flow starts with our invisual process. These are the decisions that we're making that are behind the diagram. The first step is setting an intention. Our diagrammatic intention is our unique reason for diagramming in a specific moment. Because diagrams, like anything else, are never made without intention. Intention is just not something we get to choose our way out of. Now, this is an important point that I think a lot of folks miss. For example, we think that we got away with never deciding our intention when we actually just fulfilled an intention of not knowing what we were making or why. Now, should we ever actually make a diagram with that kind of lukewarm and unsure intention, you won't be surprised when the reaction from your audience is equally as lukewarm and unsure. This means that before we get into the act of diagramming, we need to spend some time thinking about what it is we're seeking to accomplish with the diagram we're making. When setting our intention, we have to be clear and honest with ourselves about what we are actually attempting to do with this diagram. I like to ask myself 2 different questions to pressure test the strength of my diagrammatic intention. The first question is this intention something that a diagram could actually do? This question assures that I'm not using diagramming as magic or some sort of scapegoat, and making sure that I can actually achieve the thing I'm setting out to achieve. The second question is your intention achievable with something other than a diagram? This question makes sure that I'm not being too prescriptive about the form that the diagram will take. When we set our intention, if we're humble enough to be paying attention, we will likely immediately realize something is standing in the way of our ability to diagram. Here are some common places to find yourself as you work to determine your diagrammatic intention. I need to do a lot more research. I need to talk to a lot more people. I need to do other hard and time-consuming thing that stands in the way of diagramming. Or, even worse, all of the above. Now, before we start hand-wringing and blaming ourselves for not being informed enough yet to start diagramming, what if I told you that finding yourself a place on this list of thoughts is actually to be expected at this point in the process? The intention-setting step of diagramming is never a waste, even when we are not ready to proceed further into the process yet. This step is to make sure that we don't waste time thinking that we can diagram our way out of something that we need other times and tools to work through. Okay, so assuming that you made it out of that last valley with a strong enough intention set, the next step is to know who you are serving. Determining your audience for a diagram will determine a lot about it. Imagine a diagram made for a group of graduate students versus one made for a kindergarten classroom. In each phase on the road to a diagram, we are trying to answer a different core question with our research. First, we're trying to figure out how our audience understands things. Then we're modeling what might be useful. And lastly, we're making sure that our proposed diagram is performing as intended. Now, in the first phase, and even most of the second phase, we don't even have something that resembles a diagram yet to show to our audience. Yet, we are unquestionably still informing our diagram down the road by doing work researching our audience in advance of needing them to tell us if a diagram performs well or not. Now, sometimes these phases are on purpose, where we set out to understand something for the purpose of diagramming it. But more often than not, the first phase and even that second phase are actually more noticeable in hindsight. Simply put, diagrams sneak up on us. Sometimes we don't even know we are making a diagram until we're deep in the process of making it. But just because we wake up and suddenly find ourselves with diagram doesn't mean that those early parts of the process didn't happen. Sometimes our audience and our intention are set long before we know we're having a diagram at all. Our next and last stop on this in-visual on-ramp to diagramming is to scope our diagram. Now, last month, I interviewed people who self-reported to have wrestled with a diagram and lived to tell the story. There was a word that kept coming up again and again: boundaries. People told me how they needed to have these strict limits with themselves so that they knew what they were, and in most cases, more importantly, what they were not diagramming. The scope that we attempt with our diagram is a huge determining factor of if we are successful at ever even making a diagram at all. Many a sense maker gets stuck at this point on this on-ramp with the vague idea for a diagram, but not a clear enough sense of scope to get it out of their head and onto a piece of paper. When we scope our diagrams, we can easily fall victim to the same fate as any other information architecture, ending up with too much, not enough, or not the right information. Scoping is such a Goldilocks dilemma. Sometimes we add too much content, sometimes there's just too little. Other times we're just naive to what things will mean or connote to those that we intend to serve with our content. My point is, don't get discouraged if you get to this point and start to feel a little overwhelmed or underwhelmed or just plain dead wrong with what your planned scope was. This is an expected and oft experienced emotional downturn for many a sense maker who has traveled this way before you. The only way to know the right scope of our diagram is to ask our users. And the dance between understanding our audience and determining our scope can be pinged and ponged quite a bit before we finally get it right. But once we know what we're diagramming, who we're diagramming for, and why we are diagramming in the first place, now we have a string of visual decisions to make, and these ultimately determine what the audience sees as the diagram. The first visual decision is about diagrammatic scale. Even if your scope is clear in your mind, you will still need to determine the right scale in order to make final decisions about and accommodations for the content of your diagram. Diagrammatic scale is not the same as size. It's actually better thought of as a combination of size and interaction mode. It's not quite right to think about it as the more space you have, the more you can include, but it is also equally not quite right to think the bigger something is, the more brief and bold we should be. There are times when the interaction mode of the space we are given or the plan for our diagram changes what the size means for what we can include. If, for example, we were designing a museum wall, we might have the space that's equal to that of a billboard. But our audience's relationship to that space has changed based on their expected interaction mode. Same size, different scales. Museum walls are meant to be approached and therefore warrant a large active scale where we might consider more content. Billboards are meant to be driven past and therefore warrant a large passive scale, and less content will likely support our intention in that. Now that we have an understanding of our scale, it's finally time to set shapes and add lines to our diagram. I know, all of this work and 2 emotional downturns later, and we haven't even started what most people think about as diagramming yet. Shapes are the elements representing the objects in our diagrams, and lines are the elements representing the connection between those objects. Setting shapes and adding lines is this 2-step that we're doing over and over again until things feel right. I personally find, though, that setting the shapes first and getting a good arrangement of them with minimal or no lines at first really cuts down on the finessing of diagrams for fit and harmony later on as we add the lines. To help get you started with setting the shapes, I want to show you 4 common diagrammatic patterns that you can apply to a broad range of relationship types that you might want to visualize. I'm going to be using our good snack friend chips to illustrate these examples. Chips are part of the snack aisle. When we place something small within something bigger, we are often visualizing that it is a part of that larger whole. Chips lead to dip. When we place shapes next to each other and use arrows, we're visually implying a sequence where one thing leads to another thing. Chips relate to crackers. When we connect things without any directional cues, we are implying some kind of a relationship. But it's worth noting that without any further signal than just a line connecting these two, we aren't offering much about the nature of the relationship. This is relying on the user to put in a lot of work to figure out what the meaning of that line is. And they will try. We humans just can't help it. Next, we have potato chips are a type of chip. When we indent or place shapes under another shape, we're often visualizing that something is a type of a larger category or a grouping. Now, I personally find that you can get a lot diagrammatically done with just those 4 visual patterns. But the next piece of the puzzle is adding lines to further refine and reinforce how those relationships are understood by our audience. Here are 5 line-based patterns that apply to a wide variety of different kinds of relationships and build on the 4 shape-based patterns that we just talked through. The first is using non-directional lines to visualize associations. As I mentioned with the chips and cracker example, this type of line needs labeling more than the others. Consider whether you would have understood how dress and table were connected if I had not labeled them in this diagram. Next, we have one-way lines that are meant to show sequences. This means that there are set rules about the ways that a user can or should navigate something. Our third pattern is for when we use two-way lines to visualize reciprocal relationships, such as, I don't know, maybe the reciprocal relationship that you need to have with your audience should you want to make diagrams that make sense to them. This fourth pattern we generally reserve for when there's a parent-child hierarchical relationship to visualize. One important lesson for people is that there's actually 2 types of brackets, with the horizontal style being more friendly for shallow hierarchies and vertical brackets being much more forgiving of deeper ones. In many hierarchical diagrams, you'll see a combination of both for accommodating times when a structure is both wide and deep. And our final line pattern is quadrants. This is when we use the lines to delineate areas that have meaning for comparing things. You can see this in patterns like canvases and scatter plots. As we diagram, we often bring more than one of these patterns to the visual depiction that we're making. In this diagram, for example, outlining a simple website structure, I have used 4 different line patterns to illustrate 4 different relationships that pages have to one another. Setting the shapes and adding the lines is a huge part of the diagrammatic lift. There is no doubt in that. And the majority of what people think of as diagramming is actually happening at this point. But there's an important lesson that I have learned about diagramming. If you have done the due diligence of setting an intention, researching your scope with an actual audience, and determining the right scale, the shapes and lines part is easy. But if you try to jump into the shapes and lines part and you haven't done the harder work up front, get ready for frustration all the way down to visual depiction town. And we don't want that, right? So, can we just start with the actual diagramming part? Sure, but there will be consequences. And you might not like what they are, so give it a thought. As you've been making your diagram, there is one element that has followed you along the entire journey, from the very beginning: the labels. The words and phrases that we use to describe the elements of our diagram are critical to getting our point across. But they are also impossible to operate without for even a second when diagramming. This creates a quandary of process. We need labels to do our diagrammatic work. And yet, we are forced to pick out our labels so early in the process that we just don't know much when we do this important deciding. In my opinion, the nature of labels and what we need from them actually changes quite a lot as we move through each stage of the diagrammatic process. In the understanding phase of diagrams, the labels are really just falling out of our heads and we're picking them up with our hands and we're making shapes to represent them. When we're this early in the process, I like to encourage people to choose labels to get by with. And there's this relief in calling something a label by something that you know that you can and will change later on. Plus, this sets you up for the best possible chance to actually go back and refine to better labels when you understand more. In the middle, when we're modeling the diagram, we should start to put a little bit more pressure on our labels to make sense to other people. You will likely, if you have been researching with your audience, have lots of opportunities to learn about the words and phrases that do and do not make sense to them. I like to think about these as labels to get through with because they're words that you're confident will make sense, but they can still be messy or clunky or even inconsistent at this point, as long as they're pointing in the direction of getting through to your intended audience. It is not until the final delivery stage of diagramming when you fully lean on those labels to get results with. And at this point in the process, they really only need to do 2 things: speak for themselves and match your intention. Now, if neither of these things is the case yet, you still have work ahead. And the only way to achieve both of these is to have a member of your audience present your diagram back to you and see how they did on getting your message across. Did they have to ask for clarification on what something meant? Did a word or phrase throw them off or give them pause? Did any of the labels used feel confusing? The only way to know is to ask. And labels are often one of the last adjustments that we make. Labels are also the place where other people tend to have the most feedback. So get ready, get some partners, and dig into getting some labels that you can get results with. And finally, the last step and true finesse of any diagram, the addition of the key. Now here is where people trip up. Do you always need a key? The answer is yes, but with a major caveat. You don't always need a little box labeled key in the corner that describes all of the visual elements in agonizing detail. You do, however, need to be assured that every visual element is clear in its intention and its meaning. When we're in this final step of adding a key, we're adding whatever clarity we need to for users to understand the diagram part of the diagram. The addition of a box called key to explain what we mean is an essential pattern in making diagrams, for sure. But I want to introduce something perhaps a little controversial that I see all the time when there is a box called key. People relying on the use of a key to explain the wrong things. Here are 3 very wrong things that I see the key trying to do when the diagram itself is actually the one underperforming. Explaining overly complexified color coding or iconography, defining poorly labeled objects or relationships, and introducing extraneous information. If you've ever found yourself giving a tour of your diagram instead of just letting somebody consume it, even though you do have a key, or you keep saying things like, the colors is supposed to mean this, or that icon is supposed to tell you that, you might have a problem that no key can solve. When we add an element called a key, we're trying to do the audience a service by providing them with information that is key to understanding our diagram. But for everything our audience has to refer to the key to understand, we can expect a potential loss of understanding. So we have to be careful how we use the key and what level of translation we require for our audience to consume our diagram. And so, we've arrived at the determining moment of any road trip. Are we there yet? Is that simple doodle that I just made on the whiteboard a diagram? Well, let's ask ourselves 2 simple questions. Is it visually depicted? And did it help someone to understand something, even if that person was you? If yes to both, welcome to Diagram Town. As our journey together comes to a close, let's take a moment to look back in awe of what makes diagrams so dang powerful. They might be clear visual depictions that help someone to understand something now, but diagrams sure do take on a lot of complexity in order to come into the world claiming that title. Diagrams come in many shapes and sizes, and there are any number of templates and methods out there coming from any number of fields of study and practice. And people use diagrams to make sense for other people just as often as they use them to make sense of things for themselves. There is an everydayness to diagrams that not many of us totally escape. In order to help someone to understand something and thereby qualify your visual depiction for the label diagram, you have to have done a lot of hard work. I hope this tour of diagrammatic process helps you to think about how to approach your next diagram differently, and that with this new knowledge of a common diagrammatic journey that we all end up on at some point, you might feel better prepared for the peaks and valleys that are along the way. As we say goodbye, I want to remind you why we started off on this journey together today. We had a hunch that there might be more to diagrams than what meets the eye, and it turns out we were right. Thanks.
Well, amazing. Thank you so much, Abby. I love that. Diagrams, 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 and trips to Diagram Town. There's just some beautiful references in there.
Thank you.
I'm just sort of scanning for questions from the group. I had a couple of things to ask you, if that's all right. And I was really interested. It made me think a lot about wrangling with sitemaps in the past, and given the chance that we've got you on the call, IA royalty, I thought I'd take the opportunity to ask you a bit more about sitemaps, because I can remember lots of instances where I'd be sense making and wrangling with lots of things and making lots of decisions and showing them or representing them within sitemaps and showing these sitemaps to people, which were absolutely full of very, very fundamentally important things that I had no sense that they were actually understanding the importance of the decisions I'd made. And there were things that were hidden within these documents that I was quite proud of, that didn't mean anything to anyone else. How do you do good sitemaps? And do people still do them? Are they still a thing?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked this question. I feel like we all have to have a reckoning as an industry about how we've been using diagrams to sort of elicit diagrammatic insecurity on our coworkers all these years. Because you're totally right, James. Like that sitemap that you were so proud of was actually really useful, but the audience of it is you, not them. And you showing it to them is sort of like waving it around and saying, like, look at all the work I did, which can be a use in itself. Like if you're presenting to, your team, what you've been up to, showing like a big complex diagram they're not going to understand, and telling them about it can actually be really great in terms of getting people along with your process. But putting that same diagram up and saying something like, so I'm open to feedback for the next half an hour that we have booked, that's a pretty unfair move. So I think, like, to your question of like, does anybody do the sitemap thing anymore? Like, what should we be doing? I think that it really comes down to like understanding that a sitemap is good for some things. And one of the things that I think it's the best at is being an active canvas for people to have conversations about the way that users are going to navigate a site. I see a lot of people proposing sitemaps just because they think that they need to have them. It's like a thing that they feel like is a box to check on the process. Yeah. I also see people forcing the pattern of hierarchy and bracketing onto non-hierarchical content just to fit it into that traditional sitemap frame. Mm-hmm. You'll notice in the simple sitemap example that I provided in the talk, I didn't do that on purpose because I wanted to remind people that, like, when you get into something like a checkout flow, you're not actually in a hierarchy in that same sense anymore. And representing things as a flow where a user can't go certain directions or can't do certain things is much more representative. So I feel like there's a couple of tidbits wrapped up in your question. One would be know when you're drawing a hierarchy and when you're not, and be comfortable breaking the bounds of what a sitemap is. And then the second would be like, make sure that you need one for your actual intention, and that you're making one that is for the audience that you're actually showing it to.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess generally they're a useful tool to think, and they force you to understand the things you haven't properly thought about. But then I guess in the context of sitemaps, then I guess often in the past they've been seen as like a deliverable. So it's like very much a checkbox and very much a scope thing as well. But another question about in terms of interpretation. I mean, do you feel a good diagram should stand alone and be self-explanatory, or is it something that always needs to be accompanied by a conversation and a presentation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, obviously, is intention. And along with your intention, you have to be thinking about, the context that you're in and the problem space that you're in. Like today's presentation is a great example. I don't think that the flow diagram that I provided on diagramming would be all that useful to hand to somebody who's brand new at diagram and be like, hey, go figure it out. That probably would not be very useful. But I think that it made for a good visual aid as I'm walking through some pretty dense content about something that I'm trying to kind of demystify and give a structure to. So my intention is for that diagram to keep your attention while I'm talking. And it's a good, I think, successful use of what's called dual coding, when you use more than one system for, in this case, your visual and your audio at the same time. So it helps the audience kind of keep track of where you are, where you've been. So in terms of like, do I think that diagrams have to be self-explanatory? No, not necessarily. I don't think that. I think that in a lot of cases, they cannot be self-explanatory. I think that they, much more importantly, need to be fit to purpose. They need to actually work for what they were intended to work for. And if they were intended to keep your attention while I talk, I hope that didn't distract you while I talk, right? Which it could have done, and that's something that you get feedback from an audience on.
It's interesting now with everyone remote working and relying on tools like Mural and Miro and kind of very much being asked to, I guess, make sense of things or visualize ideas. And that's massive amount, that's a massive component to our work in terms of putting shape to things and showing people the beginnings of something, just to share what's in our heads that we maybe can't articulate. Then diagramming is massively important, isn't it, to start to articulate or to visualize something that would be almost impossible to describe. Or how could I ever hope to convey what's in my head and give you a clear understanding of that? But I mean, do you think these kind of new tools we've been using have helped with that? And are there any tools that you recommend or anything that you found useful?
So I'm going to take the first part of your question separately. I think that there's something really interesting about people feeling like diagrams are really good for showing other people what's in our head. I want to challenge that diagrams are really good for us to see what's in our head. And often the thing that's in our head and what we end up diagramming is different, right? So a really good example of this is I talk to people a lot that are really overwhelmed. You know, people flood into my inbox with messes to talk about, and what often happens is that they don't have a picture of the mess that they're facing. And I talk a lot with those kinds of folks about just the danger of not having an external representation of the thing that you're facing and how dangerous that is mentally, you know, because you think that you have your arms wrapped around it, but if you're honest with yourself, you don't. You have this kind of like messy sprawl of questions and assertions and like assumptions about the scope. But when you start to put it down into a visual form, you sort of have to confront yourself. And I find that like in a lot of cases, people skip that part. They go right to the part where they have to explain it to other people. And it's like, no, make the messy diagram. Make the messy diagram that's for you, that helps you to understand. And then use that messy diagram to better articulate what it is you want to articulate to any number of audiences, right? So like making that diagram of that flow helped me as a teacher to understand how I was going to frame a book. It helped me to understand how I was going to talk about this in a 20-minute talk. Like it provided things, but the original version of it was much messier and it was just for me, you know? So I think there's something there. In terms of tools though, I'm very hesitant to recommend any tool at all, because I feel like my number one piece of advice is don't let your comfort level or lack of comfort level with tools get in your way. And I really do mean that in both directions. Like if you're a person who is really talented at visual design software, be extra aware that you are potentially putting more visual distraction in the way of your thing, simply because you have a tool that allows you those advanced maneuvers. Sometimes you don't need those to get the point across, and it can be distracting. And in the opposite way, if you are not a person who's ever opened a piece of design software, I don't think that that means that you can't get value out of diagrams. Like open whatever you're good at. PowerPoint, draw, construction paper you steal from your kids. Like that's one of my favorites. So yeah, whatever the tool is that you feel the most comfortable in rendering shapes and lines, that's all you need. So don't get too precious about like what's the right tool or what's the right template. Just get in and start making the boxes and the arrows.
Thanks, Eb. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. This is from Kat. The image of your new book was at the end there of your talk. Is it going to be stuck? Can you explain why?
Yes, it is. So the image of my new book. Ooh,
oh, look at that.
It came up.
Is this world exclusive?
It has this really, really ugly thing wrapped around it because Amazon puts this like nasty not for resale band right across it. But yeah, this is the new book. It's a big book. Wow. It is bigger than my first book, which is very intimidating, y'all, because I have to still design this book. And right now it is an absolute mess. So I am very lucky to have the help of a very talented editor, and yeah, we're getting in the process. So a lot more information soon on when it's available. In terms of the name, I was really stuck on trying to figure out how I was going to get across the why of diagrams. And a big part of it was like getting across that message that like, it's not just for data nerds and process engineers. Like this is a fundamentally useful life skill. And I'm trying to like identify what is that feeling that we all have when we need a diagram. And I landed on the word stuck, and I just love it. I think it's, my toddler can say the word stuck, which is like real good news. He also thinks that it says truck on the cover of my book because he's obsessed with trucks. So yeah, it's a new name, it's a new direction, and yeah, I'm excited about it.
Awesome, thanks, Abby. We'll draw questions to a close there, and maybe if you're able to, you may be able to pick up some additional questions on Slack if that's okay.
Yeah,
but
yeah, absolutely.
We'll say thanks, Abby. Thanks again for such a great talk, and we'll throw the slides. Thank you.